I didn't notice the silence at first. At least not in the way people imagine when they hear a story like this. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly stopped. No single second where the world felt like it cracked open beneath my feet. It happened slowly, quietly, the way most painful things do. At the beginning, I simply thought she needed space. Life had been heavy for both of us during that time. Work pressures had been building, responsibilities felt endless, and the future seemed filled with decisions that neither of us were fully prepared to make yet. We had always handled challenges together before. That's why I wasn't worried in the beginning. I believed in us, and more importantly, I believed in her. She had always been the kind of person who faced problems directly. If something was wrong, she would talk about it. If she felt overwhelmed, she would say so. That honesty had always been one of the things I admired most about her. So when the distance started appearing, I assumed it was temporary. Just a phase. Something we would talk through once life calmed down again. But life rarely slows down when you ask it to. Days turned into weeks. And the conversations that once felt effortless started becoming shorter, not cold, just quieter. At first, the difference was subtle. Maybe a message that came later than usual, maybe a conversation that ended earlier than it normally would have. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make you think something serious was happening. But when small changes repeat themselves often enough, they begin forming a pattern. And patterns are hard to ignore. I remember one evening in particular. I was sitting in my living room after a long day, scrolling through messages on my phone. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside the windows. She had sent me a message earlier that afternoon, nothing unusual, just a simple question about how my day was going. I responded the way I always did. Honestly, we talked for a few minutes, then the conversation ended with something simple. Talk later. Those words just to feel normal. But that night, they stayed in my mind longer than they should have. Because something about the tone felt different. Not wrong, just distant, like someone speaking from farther away than usual. I try not to overthink it. Life gets busy, people have responsibilities. Sometimes conversations end early because there simply isn't enough energy left at the end of the day. But the next day felt similar. And the day after that, gradually, I started noticing something I hadn't paid attention to before. She wasn't sharing things the way she used to. Not the small details, not the random thoughts. Not the little stories about things that happened during her day. Those moments had always been part of how we connected. They weren't important individually, but together they created a sense of closeness, a sense that our lives were moving forward side by side. When those moments began disappearing, something else disappeared with them. The feeling that we were walking through life together. Instead, it began to feel like we were standing on separate paths, still facing each other, but no longer moving in the same direction. I remember asking her one night if everything was okay. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple question, the kind you ask someone when you care about them. She said yes. Her response sounded calm, maybe even reassuring, but something inside me hesitated. Not because I thought she was lying, but because the answer felt incomplete, as if there were words she hadn't chosen to say yet. And I respected that. Everyone deserves space when they need it, so I didn't push. I didn't demand explanations. I believed that if something was truly wrong, she would eventually tell me. That's how we had always handled things before, or at least that's how I thought we had. The following weeks continued in the same quiet pattern. Shorter conversations, less sharing, more silence between the words. Until one day something happened that I still struggle to understand. She simply stopped. Not dramatically. There was no argument, no emotional confrontation, no long explanation, just silence. The messages stopped. The calls stopped. The connection that had once felt so natural suddenly disappeared. At first I assumed something serious had happened. Maybe she was dealing with something difficult. Maybe she needed time to process something she wasn't ready to talk about yet, so I waited. A few days, then a week, then longer. But the silence remained. I tried reaching out, not obsessively, just carefully. A simple message asking if she was okay. No response. Another message a few days later. Still nothing. At that point, confusion started replacing patience. Because people don't usually disappear from someone's life without a reason. Especially not someone they once cared about deeply. That's when the questions started forming in my mind. Had I missed something? Had there been a moment where I should have understood what was happening? Was it something she needed from me that I had failed to notice? I replayed countless conversations in my head, searching for signs, looking for anything that might explain why someone who had once felt so close would suddenly walk away without explanation. But every time I retraced those memories, they looked the same. Normal. Honest. Nothing that hinted at the ending that eventually arrived. That's the hardest part about unanswered questions. Your mind keeps searching for answers even when none appear. Friends eventually started asking about her. They had noticed her absence too. And when I told them I hadn't heard from her in weeks, their reactions mirrored my own confusion. Did something happen? Did you argue? Did she say anything before she left? The answer to all those questions was the same. No. Nothing dramatic had happened. There was no clear reason, no explanation, just silence. And silence leaves people guessing. Some assumed she had simply changed her mind about the relationship. Others wondered if something had happened in her personal life that she wasn't ready to share. But the truth is, no one really knew. Not even me. Months have passed since then. Life moved forward the way it always does. Work continued. Responsibilities didn't disappear. Time kept moving. But certain questions never fully fade. Why would someone leave when things seem stable? Why disappear without explaining what changed? And perhaps the hardest question of all, did you leave because of something I never understood? I still don't have those answers. Maybe I never will. But sometimes, the most difficult part of losing someone isn't the loss itself. It's the mystery that remains behind, the unanswered questions that linger quietly in your mind long after the person is gone. Because when someone leaves suddenly like that, you don't just lose them, you lose the explanation too. And that kind of silence can stay with you longer than people realize. She left when I needed her most, and to this day, no one truly knows why. The first few weeks after she disappeared felt strangely unreal. Not in a dramatic, heartbreaking way, like people describe in movies, where someone collapses under the weight of loss. It was quieter than that, more confusing than painful at the beginning. Because when someone leaves without explanation, your mind doesn't immediately accept that they're gone. Instead, it keeps expecting them to return. Every time my phone vibrated, a small part of me wondered if it might be her. Every time I opened my messages, I half expected to see her name appear again like it always used to. But the screen remained the same. Silent. At first, I told myself, she probably just needed time. Everyone goes through difficult moments in life. Maybe she was overwhelmed with something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. Maybe she needed space to sort things out. That explanation felt reasonable. Comforting, even. So I gave her that space. I didn't flood her with messages or demand answers. I believed that if she needed distance, the respectful thing to do was allow it. But distance behaves strangely. When two people intentionally create space to breathe, it usually feels temporary. This didn't. Days passed, then weeks, and the silence between us began to feel less like space and more like absence. I remember one evening sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling through our old messages, not because I wanted to relive memories, but because I was searching for something, some sign, some clue that might explain what had happened. Maybe a conversation where she hinted that something was wrong. Maybe a moment where she seemed distant before I noticed it. But the more I read, the more confusing it became. The messages looked normal. Warm, friendly, sometimes playful. There was nothing in them that suggested someone was preparing to disappear. That realization left me with an unsettling thought. If nothing was wrong, then why did she leave? The human mind doesn't handle unanswered questions very well. It tries to fill the gaps, and during those weeks my mind created dozens of possible explanations. Maybe she was going through something personal she didn't know how to explain. Maybe she had met someone else and didn't know how to tell me. Maybe she felt overwhelmed by the direction our relationship was heading. Every possibility felt equally uncertain, and without the truth, each one lingered like a shadow. Friends began noticing the change in my mood. Not sadness, exactly, but distraction. The kind of quiet distance that appears when someone is thinking about something they can't quite solve. One evening, a close friend asked me directly, "So what actually happened between you two?" I paused before answering. "Nothing," I said. He looked confused. "Nothing? And that's the problem," I replied. "Nothing happened." He frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "I know. People want stories with clear endings. Arguments. Betrayals. Confessions, something dramatic that explains why two people stop being part of each other's lives. But sometimes relationships end without any of those things. Sometimes they simply fade, and that kind of ending is harder to process than any dramatic breakup. Because there's no moment you could point to and say that's where everything changed. Instead, you're left with silence. And silence doesn't explain itself. During those weeks, I tried to keep my life moving normally. Work continued as usual, meetings, deadlines, responsibilities. None of them paused just because something in my personal life had become confusing. In fact, work almost became a refuge. When your mind is occupied solving problems or making decisions, it temporarily stops wandering toward unanswered questions. But late at night, when everything quieted down, the thoughts returned. I would sit near the window of my apartment looking out at the city lights and wonder where she was. Not obsessively, just curiously. Was she okay? Was she happy? Did she ever think about reaching out again? Or had she simply decided that whatever we'd shared no longer mattered enough to continue? Those questions never had answers. But they lingered in the background of my mind like unfinished sentences. The strangest part was how ordinary everything else remained. The world didn't stop. The city didn't slow down. People around me continued living their lives exactly as they had before. Restaurants remained full. Friends kept laughing about things that happened during their days. The rhythm of life continued uninterrupted. And yet, somewhere inside me, something felt slightly different. Not broken, just incomplete. Like a conversation that ended before the final sentence was spoken. One afternoon, I walked through a park I used to visit occasionally. It was a warm day, and families were scattered across the grass, enjoying the sunlight. Children ran around chasing each other, while parents talked nearby. Couples sat on benches, sharing quiet conversations. Watching them stirred a strange feeling inside me. Not jealousy, not bitterness, just reflection. Relationships are complicated things. Two people can share meaningful moments for months or even years, and then suddenly one of them steps away. Sometimes there is a reason, sometimes there isn't. Or maybe the reason exists, but never gets spoken out loud. I wondered if she ever thought about those moments we had shared, the late night conversations, the laughter over small, meaningless things, the feeling that, for a while, we were walking through life side by side. Did those memories still mean something to her? Or had they already faded into the background of her life? It's impossible to know, because once someone chooses silence, their thoughts become invisible to you. Weeks eventually turned into months, and slowly, something inside me began to change. At first, the silence felt like a question waiting to be answered, but over time, I began understanding something important. Not every question receives an answer, and sometimes waiting for one keeps you stuck in the past longer than necessary. Life moves forward whether explanations arrive or not. Eventually, you reach a point where continuing to search for answers becomes more exhausting than accepting the mystery. That doesn't mean the questions disappear completely. They remain somewhere in your memory, but they stop controlling your attention. I reached that point one quiet evening while sitting alone at home. For the first time in months, I realized I hadn't thought about her all day. Not intentionally, it had simply happened. Work had been busy. Friends had invited me out for dinner. The day had unfolded normally without the constant background thought of wondering what had happened between us. And that realization felt strangely peaceful, because it meant something. Inside me had started healing without my even noticing it. She had left when I needed her most, and for a long time, that absence felt like a puzzle I had to solve. But eventually I understood something that changed the way I saw the situation. Sometimes people leave not because you failed them. Sometimes they leave because their own path is moving in a different direction. And sometimes they leave without ever explaining why. And the hardest part of all is learning to accept that the explanation may never come. By the time a few months had passed, the silence she left behind had changed shape. At first it had been loud inside my mind, like an unanswered question echoing in an empty room. Every thought circled around the same point. Why? Why did she stop talking? Why didn't she explain? Why leave without a single real goodbye? But time does something strange to questions like that. They don't disappear completely, but they soften. The sharp edge fades, and eventually the mind grows tired of repeating the same puzzle. Life slowly begins pulling your attention back toward the present. For me, that process happened gradually. Work remained busy as always. Projects came and went. New responsibilities appeared that required focus, and the rhythm of daily life continued whether my heart felt confused or not. But something inside me had changed during those quiet months. Before she left, I had always believed that relationships followed a certain logic. When people care about each other, they communicate. When something is wrong, they talk about it. When they decide to leave, they explain why. At least that's what I thought. But her disappearance taught me something uncomfortable about human relationships. Sometimes people don't leave logically. Sometimes they leave emotionally. Sometimes they leave silently because explaining their feelings would require confronting something they're not ready to face. And sometimes they leave simply because they've already moved on in their own mind long before you realize it. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me reflective. Because the truth is, everyone carries struggles you can't always see. Maybe she had been fighting something internally that I never noticed. Maybe she was trying to figure out her own future and didn't know how to include me in it anymore. Maybe there were fears or uncertainties she never expressed. Those possibilities crossed my mind many times, and strangely, thinking about them helped me let go of the need for a perfect explanation. One evening while walking home after dinner with a friend, I passed a small cafe we used to visit occasionally. It wasn't a special place by any grand standard, just a quiet corner cafe with warm lights and a relaxed atmosphere. But seeing it brought back memories immediately. I could almost picture us sitting at the small table near the window, laughing about something trivial, while the evening crowd moved in and out of the room. For a moment I stood outside looking through the glass. Inside, different people occupied those same seats now. A couple talking softly, two friends sharing coffee, life continuing exactly as it always had. And that's when something became clear. Places remember moments, but they don't hold on to them forever. People come and go. Memories form, then fade. The world moves forward whether you're ready or not. I walked inside and ordered a coffee. Not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I suddenly realized something important. Avoiding places or memories doesn't help you move on. Facing them calmly does. I sat near the same window where we once talked for hours about random topics, work, dreams, silly stories from childhood. Those conversations had felt natural at the time, effortless, like something that would simply continue evolving as life moved forward. But now I understood that some connections exist only for a certain period of time. They enter your life when you need them, they teach you something important, and then they leave. Not always with closure, not always with explanations, but their presence still shapes who you become afterward. Sitting there in that cafe, I began thinking about the version of myself from the time when she was still part of my life. Back then, I believed stability meant permanence. If two people connected deeply enough, I assumed that connection would naturally continue. But life is more fluid than that. People change, circumstances change, and sometimes the person who once fit perfectly into your world slowly becomes someone who belongs to another chapter instead. That realization didn't make the loss easier exactly, but it did make it clearer. For months I had been asking myself the wrong question. Instead of asking why she left, I should have been asking something else. What did that experience teach me? The answer wasn't simple, but over time, a few truths began emerging. First, I learned that connection is valuable even if it doesn't last forever. The moments we shared were still real. The conversations, the laughter, the feeling of understanding each other, that all existed, regardless of how the story ended. Second, I learned that closure doesn't always come from another person. Sometimes you have to create it yourself, by accepting that some questions may never be answered, by recognizing that life really provides neat conclusions. And third, I learned something about resilience. When someone leaves without explanation, it's easy to start doubting yourself. You replay every conversation looking for mistakes. You wonder if you missed something important. You question whether you could have prevented the ending somehow. But eventually, you realize something. Not every ending is within your control. Sometimes people walk away for reasons that exist entirely within their own minds. And trying to solve those reasons without their honesty is like trying to complete a puzzle with half the pieces missing. That night in the cafe, I finished my coffee slowly. Outside, the streetlights had turned on, casting long reflections across the pavement. People walked past the windows talking, laughing, living their lives. And for the first time since she left, I felt something different. Not sadness, not confusion, just acceptance. She had been part of my life for a time. Then she wasn't. And somewhere out there, she was continuing her own story. Maybe she had found the answers she was looking for. Maybe she was still searching. Either way, that chapter between us had ended. And although I never received the explanation I once hoped for, I realized something important as I stepped back outside into the cool evening air. The absence she left behind had eventually taught me something about myself. Something about patience, about letting go, about understanding that not every relationship is meant to last forever. Some exist only long enough to shape you into the person you're meant to become next. And sometimes the hardest part isn't losing someone. It's accepting that the reason they left may remain a mystery for the rest of your life. But life continues anyway, and eventually, so do you. After that evening in the cafe, something inside me finally began to settle. For months, my mind had been stuck in the same place, circling around memories, replaying conversations, trying to understand something that never came with an explanation. But once I stopped forcing answers out of silence, the weight of it all started to loosen. It wasn't that I suddenly forgot her. People don't disappear from your memory that easily. Instead, the memories began changing shape. They stopped feeling like open wounds and started feeling more like distant photographs, moments that once meant everything, now simply part of the past. At first, I didn't notice when that shift started happening. But one day, something small made it clear. I was walking through a grocery store on a normal afternoon, picking up things for dinner. It was the kind of routine errand that never carries much emotion. Just shelves, carts, people moving quietly through their own lists of things to buy. As I passed the coffee aisle, I noticed the brand she used to like. For a moment I paused. Months earlier, seeing something like that would have immediately pulled me back into memories of her. How she used to joke about how strong she liked her coffee, how she insisted mornings weren't real until the first cup. But that day felt different. The memory appeared, but it didn't pull me into it. It simply passed through my mind like a quiet thought. And then I continued walking. That was the moment I realized something important. Healing doesn't happen through grand dramatic breakthroughs. It happens through ordinary moments where the pain simply stops being the center of your attention. Later that evening, while cooking dinner at home, I thought about how strange the entire experience had been. Not the relationship itself. That part had been real. But the ending, the silence, the complete absence of explanation. Most people imagine breakups as emotional conversations where both sides say difficult things and eventually walk away with some form of closure. But what I experienced had been something entirely different. It was more like a door quietly closing without anyone announcing it. One day the connection existed. The next day it didn't. And for a long time, that quiet disappearance had felt harder to process than any argument ever could, because arguments at least contain answers. Silence doesn't. But over time, I began understanding something that made the entire situation easier to accept. Closure isn't something another person gives you, it's something you create for yourself. Waiting for someone else to explain their choices keeps you tied to their decisions. Accepting that their reasons may remain unknown frees you to move forward with your own life. And once that understanding settled in, the past began losing its grip on me. Weeks turned into months. My life slowly filled with new routines, new conversations, new experiences. Work continued evolving. Friends remained part of my daily life. The world kept moving the way it always does. And gradually, the chapter she belonged to felt further away. One night, during dinner with a group of friends, someone asked a question that would have been difficult for me to answer earlier. Do you ever hear from her anymore? For a moment, the table grew quiet. Everyone knew what they meant. Everyone knew the story had ended strangely. But this time, answering felt simple. No, I said calmly. One of them looked surprised. Doesn't that bother you? I thought about it for a moment. Not anymore. That answer felt honest, because something important had changed inside me. At the beginning, the mystery of her leaving had felt like something unfinished. But over time, I realized something surprising. Not every story needs a clear explanation in order to end. Sometimes the ending itself is simply the moment when two people stop being part of each other's lives. No dramatic reason, no final conversation, just distance. And while that kind of ending once felt confusing, it eventually started feeling like something else. A reminder that people are complex. They carry thoughts and struggles that even the people closest to them may never fully understand. Maybe she had reasons she couldn't explain. Maybe she believed leaving quietly was easier than trying to articulate feelings she couldn't fully describe. Or maybe her life had simply moved in a direction where I no longer fit. And the truth could be any of those things. Or something entirely different. But after enough time had passed, I realized something important. Knowing the exact reason wouldn't actually change anything now. She was gone, and life had continued moving forward. One weekend afternoon, I decided to take a long walk through the city. The weather was cool, and the streets were filled with people enjoying the day. Street musicians played music near busy intersections, couples wandered between shops, and the energy of the city felt vibrant in a way that reminded me how alive the world always is. As I walked, I noticed something about myself. I wasn't thinking about the past anymore. My attention was on the present moment, the movement of people around me, the sound of music echoing off buildings, the feeling of fresh air after spending most of the week inside offices and meeting rooms. And in that moment, a realization quietly appeared. The chapter with her had ended, but the story of my life hadn't. That might sound obvious, but when you're inside a confusing ending, it can sometimes feel like everything is paused, like the uncertainty has frozen your ability to move forward. But eventually, the world reminds you that your story continues whether you understand the past or not. New people appear, new experiences unfold, new possibilities slowly begin taking shape. And one day, you realize that the absence, which once felt overwhelming, has become simply part of your history. Something that shaped you, something that taught you patience, something that reminded you how unpredictable relationships can be, but no longer something that controls your future. As the evening sun began lowering across the buildings, I sat down on a bench overlooking a busy street. Cars moved slowly through traffic while people crossed sidewalks in every direction, thousands of lives intersecting briefly before continuing on their own paths. And that image felt strangely symbolic, because relationships are a lot like those intersections. Sometimes two paths cross and continue together for a long time. Sometimes they cross only briefly before separating again, and neither situation is necessarily wrong. They're simply different parts of life's unpredictable design. Looking back, I realized something about her leaving that I hadn't understood at the beginning. It wasn't just a loss, it was also a lesson. A lesson about acceptance, about understanding that not every relationship is meant to last forever, and about recognizing that unanswered questions don't have to prevent you from continuing your journey. She left when I needed her most. That part of the story will always remain true. But over time, I learned something equally important. Her leaving didn't define the rest of my life. It simply became one chapter among many. And the story continues long after that chapter ends. Months passed and life gradually began settling into a rhythm again. Not the same rhythm I had before she left, but a different. One quieter in some ways, clearer in others. At the beginning, the absence she left behind had felt enormous, like a space in my life that couldn't be filled or explained. Every day had carried a quiet echo of that question I never managed to answer. Why? But time has a way of reshaping even the deepest questions, not by answering them, but by slowly making them less central to your life. At first, I noticed that in small ways. There were days when I didn't think about her at all until evening arrived. Then eventually there were days when her name didn't appear in my thoughts until someone else mentioned it. And eventually there were entire weeks where life simply moved forward without that old curiosity tugging at the back of my mind. That didn't mean the past had disappeared. It simply meant that it had found its proper place. Behind me. One evening after work, I met an old friend for dinner at a small restaurant we both liked. It is a kind of place where conversations stretch naturally because the atmosphere feels relaxed. Halfway through the meal, the topic somehow drifted toward relationships. It happens easily when people reach a certain stage in life. Everyone has stories, some happy, some complicated, some unfinished. My friend asked me something simple. Do you ever wish she had explained why she left? For a moment, I thought about it. Earlier in the year, that question would have carried a lot of weight. But now the answer felt surprisingly calm. Sometimes, I admitted, that I added something that surprised even me. But I don't need it anymore. He raised an eyebrow slightly. What changed? I leaned back in my chair and considered how to explain it. Time, I said eventually. Time is a strange teacher. At first it forces you to sit with confusion. Then it gives you distance. And once that distance appears, perspective follows. The truth is, the explanation I once wanted probably wouldn't have changed anything. Even if she had told me exactly what she was thinking, the ending would still have been the same. She chose to leave. And once someone makes that decision, the reasons behind it don't always matter as much as we think they do. That realization didn't arrive instantly. It took months of quiet reflection, months of living normally while the memory slowly softened. But once I accepted it, something inside me became lighter. Because holding on to unanswered questions is exhausting. It keeps your mind tied to the past in ways that prevent you from fully experiencing the present. Letting go of the need for those answers doesn't erase the past, but it allows you to continue living without constantly looking backward. After dinner that night, I walked home through the city streets. The air felt cool, and the sidewalks were busy with people finishing their evening routines. Some were walking home from work. Others were meeting friends. Some were simply wandering through the city the way people do when they want to clear their minds. Watching them reminded me of something simple but important. Everyone carries stories that other people know nothing about. The man walking past me might be celebrating good news. The woman waiting for a taxi might be dealing with heartbreak. The couple laughing outside a restaurant might have spent months rebuilding a relationship after difficult times. From the outside, all those lives look ordinary. But inside each person's mind, entire emotional landscapes exist. That thought made me realize something about my own story with her. For a long time, I had viewed it as something unusual, a relationship that ended without explanation. But the truth is, many people experience endings like that. Not every relationship concludes with clear communication. Not every chapter closes neatly. Sometimes people simply step away from each other's lives. And over time, the mystery becomes part of the memory. As I continued walking, I passed a small park where people often sat in the evenings. I decided to stop for a moment. The park was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional conversation between people sitting on nearby benches. I found a spot near the edge of the path and sat down. Looking around, I realized how much life had changed in the months since she left. Not dramatically, but steadily. The confusion that once filled my thoughts had slowly been replaced by something else. Clarity. Not clarity about why she left. That question still didn't have an answer, but clarity about something more important. My life was still moving forward, and that movement didn't depend on anyone else's decisions. For a long time, I believed relationships were essential pillars of our lives, something stable that remained once it was built. But the experience with her taught me something different. Relationships are more like intersections. Two lives meet. They travel together for a while, and sometimes they continue in the same direction, but sometimes they separate, and neither path is necessarily wrong. They simply lead to different places. That realization removed the bitterness I once felt about the way things ended. Instead of seeing her departure as abandonment, I began seeing it as a divergence. Our lives simply moved in different directions. Maybe she'd realized something about her future that I didn't know. Maybe she felt that leaving was necessary for reasons she couldn't explain. Or maybe she simply felt something change inside her that she didn't know how to communicate. Whatever the truth was, it existed in her world now, and my life continued in mine. As the sky slowly darkened above the park, I thought about something that once would have seemed impossible. I hoped she was doing well, not in a distant, indifferent way, but genuinely. Because despite the confusion surrounding her departure, the time we shared had still been meaningful. It had taught me things about patience, about acceptance, about the complicated nature of human emotions. Those lessons remained valuable even after the relationship ended. Eventually, I stood up and began walking home again. The city lights were brighter now, reflecting off windows and sidewalks as night settled over the streets. And as I walked, one final realization settled quietly in my mind. She had left when I needed her most. That part of the story would never change. But over time, I had learned something equally important. Even when someone leaves without explanation, life continues writing new chapters, and sometimes those chapters become more meaningful than the ones that came before, because they are written with a deeper understanding of who you are, what you value, and how strong you can be even when answers never arrive. Her silence had once felt like the end of something important, but now it simply felt like part of the journey that brought me to the person I had become. And that realization made the future feel open again. Not defined by what had been lost, but shaped by everything that still remained ahead. By the time nearly a year had passed since she left, the story had settled into something quieter inside me. Not a wound, not even a mystery anymore. just a memory. It's strange how time reshapes things that once felt overwhelming. In the beginning, every thought about her carried questions. Every memory felt like something unfinished. It was as if my mind refused to accept an ending that came without explanation. But eventually, the mind grows tired of searching for answers that never arrive. And when that happens, something important takes its place. Acceptance. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows the past to remain where it belongs, behind you. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun had just begun to rise, and the light spilling through the window filled the room with a calm, quiet feeling that only exists before the world fully wakes up. I made coffee and sat by the window watching the city slowly come alive. People walking to work, cars moving through intersections, the ordinary rhythm of daily life beginning again. And in that quiet moment, I realized something surprising. The story with her no longer felt heavy. It simply felt finished. For months I had believed the lack of explanation meant the story was incomplete. But that morning I understood something differently. The story had ended the moment she chose silence. Whether I understood it or not didn't change the fact that the chapter was already closed. That realization didn't feel sad. It felt peaceful. Because sometimes the hardest part of moving forward isn't losing someone. It's believing that you need their explanation in order to continue living your life. But the truth is, life never waits for explanations. It simply keeps moving. Over the following weeks, that calm feeling stayed with me. Work continued evolving, new projects appeared, new conversations happened, and slowly, the future began feeling more interesting than the past. One afternoon, while sitting with a group of colleagues during lunch, someone asked a question that made the table laugh. If you could go back and change one thing in your past, what would it be? Everyone started answering with funny stories about mistakes or awkward moments from years ago. When my turn came, I paused for a moment. For a long time, I might have said something about her. Maybe I would have wished for a conversation where she explained why she left. Maybe I would have wished for a chance to understand what had happened. But now, the answer felt different. I wouldn't change anything, I said. They looked surprised. Nothing, one of them asked. I shook my head. No. And I meant it. Because even though her departure had once confused me, it had also taught me something important about life and relationships. Not every story needs a perfect ending to be meaningful. Some experiences exist only to shape you, to teach you patience, to remind you that people are complex and unpredictable, and to show you that your own strength often appears only after someone else disappears. Later that evening, while walking home through the city, I passed the same park where I had spent many evenings thinking about the past. The benches were filled with people again, couples talking quietly, friends sharing stories, a few individuals sitting alone, lost in their own thoughts. Watching them reminded me of something simple. Everyone is moving through their own chapter of life. Some are beginning relationships, some are ending them, some are healing from things that other people will never fully understand, and all of them are continuing forward whether they realize it or not. Life doesn't pause for clarity, it moves with or without it. As I continued walking, I thought about something that had slowly changed inside me. The way I viewed relationships, before her, I believed that connection meant permanence. If two people cared about each other deeply enough, I assumed they would find a way to stay. But now I understood something more realistic. Some connections are temporary. They appear in your life when you need them. They teach you something important. And then they leave. Not because they were meaningless, but because their role in your life has already been fulfilled. That perspective changed the way I thought about the entire experience. Instead of seeing her leaving as something unfair or incomplete, I began seeing it as a moment that forced me to grow. It forced me to face uncertainty, to sit with unanswered questions, and to eventually accept that not everything in life will make perfect sense. Those lessons stayed with me, and strangely, they made me stronger. Not harder, just stronger. Because once you've accepted that some chapters end without explanation, you stop fearing uncertainty as much. You understand that life will always contain mysteries, and that's okay. When I finally arrived home that evening, I sat down near the window again. The city lights stretched across the skyline just like they had on so many nights before. But this time, my thoughts were focused on something different. The future. Not in a dramatic or ambitious way. Just in the quiet sense that life was still unfolding. New people would eventually appear. New experiences would shape the next chapters, and whatever relationships existed ahead would be influenced by everything I had learned along the way. Because every experience changes the way you approach the future. Her leaving had taught me patience. It had taught me acceptance, and it had taught me that closure is something you create within yourself. Those lessons would remain part of me long after the memory of confusion faded. Before going to bed that night, one final thought crossed my mind. If I ever saw her again someday, I wouldn't feel anger. I wouldn't demand explanations. I would simply recognize her as someone who once shared a chapter of my life, someone who walked beside me for a time before choosing another path. And that would be enough. Because sometimes the most powerful form of closure isn't an answer, it's the quiet understanding that your life continued anyway. She left when I needed her most, and for a long time that moment felt like the end of something important. But now I see it differently. It wasn't the end of my story. It was simply the moment where a new chapter began, one that taught me more about strength, patience, and acceptance than any explanation ever could. And life, as it always does, kept moving forward from there. By the time another season had passed, the memory of her leaving had become something quieter inside me. Not forgotten, but settled, like a chapter in a book you once read many times but no longer feel the need to reopen. Life had continued the way it always does. Days filled with responsibilities, small conversations, random moments of laughter with friends, and the quiet routines that slowly rebuild a sense of normalcy. At first, I hadn't noticed when things truly changed. But one afternoon, it became clear. I was sitting in a small cafe near my office, the kind of place I often visited during busy days when I needed a break from work. The room was filled with people talking, typing on laptops, and waiting for their orders to be called. A couple walked in and sat at the table next to mine. They looked new to each other. You could tell from the way they spoke carefully at first, choosing words slowly, asking questions that people usually ask when they're still learning about someone's life. Where did you grow up? What do you do for work? What kind of things do you enjoy doing when you have free time? The conversation was simple, but it reminded me of something. Every relationship begins with curiosity. Two people sitting across from each other trying to understand the person they just met, listening, sharing, gradually discovering whether their stories might continue together or eventually separate. Watching them talk made me realize something important. For a long time after she left, I had believed that part of my life had ended permanently. But the truth was simpler. It had simply paused. Not because I was incapable of moving forward, but because I needed time to understand what had happened and who I had become after it. Healing doesn't just remove pain, it also rebuilds confidence. And confidence in relationships takes time to return after someone disappears without explanation. But sitting there in that cafe, listening to the quiet conversation happening beside me, I noticed something surprising. I didn't feel guarded anymore. I didn't feel afraid of connection. Instead, I felt calm. Because the experience with her taught me something valuable. Relationships are not promises of permanence. They are opportunities for connection. Some of them last for years. Some last for only a short chapter. But each one shapes you in ways that prepare you for the next part of your life. That realization didn't make me eager to rush into something new. It simply made me open again, open to conversations, open to meeting people without comparing them to the past, open to the possibility that life still had meaningful connections waiting ahead. When I finished my coffee and left the cafe, the afternoon sun was bright and the streets were busy with people moving between their own plans and responsibilities. Walking through the city, I noticed how alive everything felt. The sounds of traffic, the movement of crowds, the small details that usually fade into the background when your mind is occupied with personal struggles. For months after she left, I had walked through those same streets while lost in my own thoughts. But now the world felt clearer again, more present. Later that evening, I met a friend for dinner. During the conversation, he asked something that once would have been difficult for me. So, if she suddenly came back and tried to explain everything, what would you do? I thought about it for a moment. Earlier in the year, I might have imagined that situation many times. I might have believed I needed that conversation to finally close the chapter. But now the answer felt different. I'd listen, I said. And then I'd probably thank her for the time we shared. He looked confused. That's it? I smiled slightly. Yes. Because by that point I understood something clearly. The explanation no longer had power over my life. Whether she returned or not, didn't change the person I had become during the months after she left. The patience I learned, the acceptance I developed, the ability to move forward without needing perfect answers, those things were mine now, and they would stay with me regardless of what happened next. After dinner, I walked home through quiet streets while night slowly settled over the city. The air felt cool and calm, and the lights from buildings reflected softly across the sidewalks. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was thinking about possibility. Not a specific person, not a particular outcome, just the simple understanding that life was still unfolding. New chapters would appear, new conversations would begin, and somewhere ahead, someone else might eventually walk into my life. Someone who didn't belong to the past. Someone who would know me as the person I had become after everything I experienced. That thought didn't feel dramatic or romantic, it felt natural. Because life rarely moves in straight lines. It moves through chapters. Some chapters are joyful, some are confusing, some end without the answers we once believed we needed. But every chapter contributes to the story. Every experience shapes the person who continues walking forward. By the time I reached my apartment that night, the city had grown quieter. I stood by the window for a moment, looking out across the lights, stretching into the distance. A year earlier, I had stood in that same spot, asking myself endless questions about why someone had left my life without explanation. Now, standing there again, the questions no longer felt important. What mattered was something else entirely. I continued living, continued growing, continued learning how to accept the parts of life that never fully make sense, and somehow, through all of that, I had found peace again. She left when I needed her most. That part of the story would always remain true. But the rest of the story had continued long after that moment, and now, looking toward the future, I realized something simple but powerful. Her leaving didn't define my life. It simply prepared me for the chapters that were still waiting to be written.